the Grand Marais Planning Commission meeting March 4th, 2020 to order. Let the record show that all commission members are present. We have an agenda before us. Is there any additions or changes to that agenda?
I'll make a motion to approve it as suggested.
I'll second.
Motion has been made and seconded to approve the agenda as presented. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. We have minutes of our previous meeting. Any corrections or changes to that?
Read out correctly?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second it.
Motion has been made and seconded to approve the minutes as presented. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Minutes are approved. We have no public hearings at this meeting scheduled. We have one item of old business, but before we get to that, Hal wanted to just make a statement here.
I want to introduce Doug Sanders in the audience here. He's a reputable actuary, nationally known. He does work for the Native American tribes at Free Bono, and he's respected all over the country. In fact, years ago, we had allied businesses where he was the actuary with North American Life and Casualty and Philharmonic Insurance in Grand Rapids. And he and his wife Mary are great philanthropists for Cook County. And he is a brilliant man, and he's very interested in housing, and that's why I invited him to be here. Okay.
Well, now that Hal has embarrassed you, welcome.
To reciprocate and try to embarrass Hal, when I was before moving to.
Get him a mic.
Actually, back in foremost, top insurer of manufactured housing, affordable housing. Hal was on the board for a while, Foremost Insurance, and did you know maybe you're getting embarrassed now. He's a member of the Manufactured Housing Hall of Fame. How about that? Anyway.
There you go. You never let us know that. Okay. Chris, welcome. Jeff, I mean, young Chris, what am I talking about?
Yeah, it's Chris, though.
Yeah, no, Chris.
Just
Yeah.
kidding.
No, Jeff, thank you. Thank you. Sorry. I see you have some more materials. You've got some information to present to us, so.
Yep, I think it's going to be more of a discussion this time around, hopefully.
Yep.
But we're definitely going to dig in. So, I don't know, maybe Mike wants to start, because the first thing we want to talk about, at least for the 10 minutes or so, maybe.
Yeah, this is more of a step back than a step forward, but I think it's of use just to remind ourselves and make sure that we're actually all in agreement on what it is we're trying to do here. So here's the statement that we've been using to notify folks of this effort. The City Council has recognized the need for additional housing in Grand Marais, and access to housing that all people can afford throughout their lives was established as a community value in Grand Marais' recent vision plan. We can all stipulate that is true. The Planning Commission believes the best way for the city to aid in the development of more housing is to increase property owner builder access to existing utilities and infrastructure. Increased density will provide additional opportunities for housing in the city without the substantial levy increases required to fund new utilities and infrastructure projects. So a lot of information included in those two statements. I think that's where all these kind of conversations have focused our efforts. We've recognized that we're not going to build new utilities as a way to solve the housing problem. It doesn't. We've been focusing on strategies that allow us to use the existing ones in more efficient ways, which means more units attached to the same place, which means more density. To support housing growth framing statement, the following guiding principles are proposed. Achieve the community vision on housing, so that's what we're trying to do here. We want rules that are easy to understand and comply with, so when we write zoning ordinance, we don't want it to be confusing, we want it to be easy to understand. We want somebody to know, am I following this rule or not, without having to hire an expert. Remove barriers to new housing units. Most of our strategies are trying to do that. Allow additional use of existing public infrastructure. Bring most existing residential development into compliance. That's towards the bottom of the list. I think that's something we've talked about a little bit, and it's more of a side benefit than an actual primary goal. But we know, based on our data collection, that there are a lot of lots that don't comply with our existing rules, and that we've looked at how many of them would be in compliance if we changed the rules to different ways. And then this tricky one at the end here, that hopefully we'll spend some time on tonight. Design regulations are limits to protect top community values and issues. So when we think about, well, more units to the same amount of infrastructure, one strategy is narrower lots. How narrow should they be? You can look at our existing lot widths to try and figure out what's appropriate based on what fits with what's already there, but that's not going to give you more housing units. That's going to give you the same number. You can try and look at what other cities' regulations are, but it's tough to compare what's established there versus what's established here. There's really not a good grounding for us to pick a number from, so it feels sort of arbitrary. So instead, we need to remember, well, what is lot width designed to protect or offer, and figure out which of those things are the most important to us, and are we still protecting it in a way that's meaningful at a new lot width, or a new setback, or a new number of units per acre, or whatever the new rule gets to be. That's been our struggle this past month, to figure out how to get the conversation to that place. And really, that's the place where I think we can have the most effective interaction with the public on this, not talking about lot width or setback or other things where we'll just put people to sleep, but rather talking about some of the things we're going to get into tonight. Does that list make sense to people? Or are we getting it there? Is there something that someone would add to that?
Can, number 4 here, allow additional use of existing public infrastructure. What do you mean by that? Or what is meant by that?
We mean by that if you just take any block in town, for example, where there's water and sewer in the street already, and based on our existing rules, you might be able to get 8 or 10 units on a block of an avenue connected to that existing infrastructure. And if we create rules that allow more units to be connected to that, we're meeting this goal number 4. Additional use. So additional housing units attached to existing infrastructure.
We have approved 2 lots on 8th Avenue. I just drove by them, and then both of them sold just like that.
Yeah.
And they don't meet the 10,000 feet, so we did it at a lower level lot, and of course it's cheaper to heat it, and it's cheaper to buy it, and so that fills, I think, a gap in our housing situation.
I would also agree, when we were here last with you, Jeff, we were talking about different housing, options. Do we like this and like this? And I think that we had reached this sort of consensus, maybe, like, it's not really about what kind of house it is, but, we don't really care if it's this or this, just how do you get, increase the density. Mm-hmm. So, I think that's where we left off. One thing that we haven't, I'm looking at this second paragraph about the planning commission believes that the best way. Have we talked so much about, if we're going to increase property owner builder access to existing utilities, are we also talking about the fees of that we, charge people for hookups and whatnot? Because I think we've had a conversation where there's sort of a flat rate, and I believe is like, so what do you do with that money when you collect it? And like, it gets put into a pot, and correct me if I'm wrong, because eventually we're going to have to upgrade things, and but like, is that not a conversation? Should we not have conversations about fees for hookups as well? How do you to me, like, increasingly, if I have a hookup and I want to put a garage with an apartment, and I want to access that same hookup, that price can be very prohibitive.
Yeah.
You know, so like, how do we work with that?
Not sure you get direct access to that in the planning commission.
Okay.
I think if you say that's a barrier to new housing units that you want to talk about removing, you could make that recommendation to the Public Utilities Commission who sets those fees.
Okay.
Their mission is not to do this.
Right.
But, you know, we're all
Maintain
trying to work
with that.
together,
Yep,
right? So
yep.
if, and I think particularly if we do make it easier for multiple unit developments to occur, and I'm not talking about a 25-unit apartment, I'm
Right.
talking about like a 3 or 4 unit structure.
Yep.
Our fees aren't designed for that sort of thing very well right now, and it might be something that they need to consider.
Okay.
So we could build that into, if we
Yeah,
had
I mean, I don't
a
think
list of
from the public
recommendations.
utility side that we've heard on single-family homes that fee is particularly prohibitive. I mean, it's really,
I felt like we've had some of those conversations, but I might be, I don't know.
well,
you know?
I think some of those conversations have happened, you know, I think when the developer bought the Joins property up on Fourth Avenue West, there were some issues about the fees and such for creating multiple lots and all that. But I don't think from the public utilities side, we've heard on individual homes that have been built on some of these infill lots. I mean, I don't.
I just think it's a conversation that probably will come up, and I'm not quite sure where it
Yeah.
it comes.
I mean, it's
you know?
worthwhile to have that conversation, because if fees are construed as being.
In the way.
Yeah, prohibitive to creating housing, then we should be talking about, you know, okay, what are the needs of the utilities to charge these fees? And
Now, how do they
what's-
determine what that price
what's-
is? And
Yeah, and it's been a
Yeah.
long time since they've done any real study of that issue. And it's hard to look at a market comparison for what those fees ought to be. We'll have to do some analysis to think about how many units of housing do we need to add before we need to make an expansion to the water treatment plant? You know?
Right.
Mike, that's a good question, and I want to answer part of it for you. The builder that was a friend of mine that bought the Joins property, and he complained about the hookup costs, and that was right on what
Okay.
you're talking about. And he dropped out because of that.
His bigger obstacle was the idea of separate water and sewer connections for each of his structures, because he wanted to sell them separately.
Right, and we've had those conversations, like how do you meter each one of those? And I get that, that can be a real,
And-
like if it's your property and you want to
Yeah,
put a little rental unit in the back, you know, and
Right.
you're still going to be, you know, it's still your, and you're not selling it, you know, because, I mean, yeah.
that's one, that, you know, and I think that can be achieved pretty easily with a few zoning rule changes, but still the idea of a 6 or 8 or 10 unit where they're gonna be owned separately.
Right.
We're talking about having to dig up a significant piece of the street still. So yes, existing infrastructure, you don't have to build new mains necessarily, but you've got a lot of infrastructure work to do to achieve separate connections for all those
Right.
buildings, because we don't have separate connections for, you know, every 40-foot lot that could exist, already built into the system.
No, and I think in our conversations, we don't, there's not that, correct me if I'm wrong, that many opportunities where like, hey, we could put 10 things here. or
Yeah.
8, you know, I mean,
There's
that,
not.
you know, we don't really have that, so I mean.
And I think that, you know, a couple of the options that we had looked at our last meeting, you know, the cottage community or some of the townhouse or, you know, that.
houses.
Row
Row houses,
houses
yeah.
and such, that there may be, maybe some ways to have this conversation about those kinds of developments, whether those types of single or multiple.
Right, but ultimately, we're
hookups.
kind of landlocked in.
Well, but are there ways around that, or ways to address the concerns that the public utilities has and still keep those costs to a developer low? So, I mean, you know, rather than having all individual services, could they be a common service with the homeowners association
sure.
that manages it and provides the easements and
Sure.
such that.
And I think we've had some of those conversations where like there's one big giant septic system, like you get your property, but you, or like you own this home, but you don't own the property. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Well, I'm thinking of like this cottage concept where there might be 4 or 5 different homes in a cluster that might be all individually served by sewer and water, but is it off one main line that they are served, or are they all individually served off of
Right.
the main? I mean, that makes a difference certainly in the costs of the development, and how that's done. There are protections to the city if there's ways that those can be done, cheaper and more collectively rather than having all individual services. And but the city has to protect its interest, the public utilities.
Of course,
has to
with,
have
there's
the
no
ability
question
of-
about that.
And the owners have to have the ability to
Yep.
to manage their systems separately from the others
Yep.
too, so. But those are conversations we can have about those, I think, that, especially in terms of how it affects, the pricing.
And that particular project is a good one to kind of run through the thought exercise to, when we're looking at some of these changes. Might even be interesting to bring him in here and talk to him about it. Some of the reasons why I would imagine he backed out of that project were how complex it is to build what he wanted to, given our existing rules about lot sizes and setbacks and separate ownership
Which is
of
another
joint
issue.
structures.
Yeah.
And if all those things get cleared up, where he doesn't have to wonder, is this going to be approved or not, based on a conditional use, you might have a lot more comfort in investing money in the infrastructure at that point.
Well, so far, we've talked about kind of the dimensional standards and that kind of thing, but this kind of a standard is not, generally, it wouldn't be contained within the zoning regulations, but still might be a barrier to a developer.
Just wanted to throw it out there,
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
somehow,
that's
when we
good.
talk about increased property access to city utilities, if we're talking about increasing density, if we're talking about ways to have people who have properties can use their property to maybe create more housing opportunities, they're gonna want water, they're gonna want sewer, and how does that work, and what fees do they pay if they're controlling both of them, so, yeah,
Well,
somebody's gotta come up.
So that is a good thing to remember, that it's not just the pipes out there, you can just connect to it, and there's no effort or cost involved.
Right.
But the other thing to remember is that if you've created a new lot that didn't exist before because the regulations didn't allow it, the assessor looks at a piece of property now and says, if that's a lot that you can build on, I'm going to value it at $60,000 to $80,000. So that's a lot of money you just created that can be used to do that investment in that infrastructure.
Sure. I see your point. So where are we off to?
Are we good?
Well, I think we're good.
Principles for right now? We can come back to them if we need to. Yeah, so just to step back. What we're gonna try to cover tonight or this afternoon is, we talked about number 1. I'm gonna go over kind of quickly existing residential lots, and we did measure things, so we have an idea of what's out there today and
All right.
what you could use to inform how you reduce some of the standards or change some of the standards. And I was gonna send it to put it on the screen, but our office's server died this morning and I couldn't get to it, so
Bad
it's,
timing.
it's right here. I printed it, so if you can't see it,
Can get up and walk
you
over.
can
if we
walk
need
over
to.
there and,
Okay.
we have all the information there. I would have tried to get it up on the screen as well, but wasn't able to do that while I was driving. And then we're gonna spend most of the time on this priority zoning standard. So I think the ones that we really wanna focus on are setbacks, and this has changed since even the last meeting. I'd say that we've talked about reducing lot size. I think some of these, I felt like maybe they were not avenues to go down, and in talking with staff a little bit more, we're like, no, I think we need to look at some of these a little bit harder. So we're gonna talk about side yard setbacks. street or front and then rear. We've been talking about lot width, talking about lot depth, but that's not a big deal, but we should talk about it. And then these other ones. So we'll go through those because I think those are the key ones to think about. And we can zoom it, narrow down the options of what we're trying to impact. And then we'll talk a little bit about building design standards and site design standards. And then I would say for this, today, we're talking mostly about a structure on a lot. This idea of multiple structures on one lot. So whether that's an accessory dwelling unit, courtyard houses, tiny houses, or mobile homes, that I'll be ready for that next meeting. I think that's gonna take, that just needs more time. And the good thing, if I'm reading the code right, is that your current code allows multiple residences on a lot, I think.
The way we treat it now is if you want multiple structures of any kind on any lot, as long as each of them can exist with their own regulations as if they had their own lot, you can
Yeah.
do that. So if we're changing these regulations to make it a lot easier for somebody to be on a lot, some of that's just gonna get taken care of.
Yeah.
But the typical model of accessory dwelling unit that you might imagine, a detached garage in the side or rear yard that has an apartment included in it, that may not be taken care of, and it'll still need to be, we'll need to figure that out. You know, the artist shed in the backyard that you're renting out to somebody, something like that.
But you're talking about primary structures that have a residence in them, not a standalone garage or a
Right.
garden shed or things.
Principal
things-
structure,
I mean,
principal
these-
versus accessory structures.
Yeah, but these rules we're talking about are mainly gonna be aimed at principal structures, but they would apply to if you had a secondary principal structure. And we still have to deal with the idea of what's an accessory dwelling unit set of rules that we want to adopt.
Yeah, so
Yes.
some codes will say only one structure on a lot, and so that would be a bigger barrier to get over. But since your code already says, you know, that's allowed if you meet these standards, like Mike said, if we were changing the standards, it should be easier to do that type of housing going forward. So, existing residential lots, so we measured them, we focused on, and we had to do this one by one, but we just did the red ones, because they're the smallest ones, you remember that? And the typical width, there's about 30 of these, which is a lot of them, that are 40 feet wide. So that must have been what was needed at the time. There's a lot of them that are exactly 40 or really close to 40. There's just a few smaller than that. So when we look through these regulations, I think they seem like they work. I mean, you know where some of those lots are. But when we start to look at things like lot coverage, I don't see any like major red flags like, oh, those lots are too small, they're causing problems related to other standards. So far, I wouldn't say that I'm seeing that. So that's new information. I think before this, I was thinking 50 wasn't a good number to go to. We've seen precedents in other cities of 35 and 40. So the fact that you have so many 40s, I think is great, that you could consider 40 being the new lot minimum. Lot depths, that was really done by hand, like my pen, not even on the computer, but, where was that? Yeah, so we just went, I think it's this one. Yeah, I have my notes on here. So I went through, so lot depth is primarily set by the size of the block. So if the block's 280 feet wide, it's gonna be at about 140 feet depth, or 135 if there's an alley that is being used or not being used. So there's not a lot of variation in those. So you see that east-west lots, which is, you know, the majority of the lots in Grand Marais are facing east or west. They're 140 or 135 feet in depth. Where the variation is in these lots, and there's more than I thought, but some of these blocks have an alley, that T alley, so these lots end up being shallower. But, you know, even on blocks that don't have lots, if the lots are facing north or south, they end up being shallower. So there's lots that are smaller, they're 120 feet, there's some that are 100, there's some 75, and there's some that 40, and you probably know where those are, because you probably walk by them, and there are some small lots, so. So that's what's out there today as far as lot depths. Square footage of existing structures, we've tried to measure, or measure those. It's difficult to get at it, and we had numbers, and then I spot checked them, and they weren't correct. We got some new numbers. Part of the challenge is this county's data captures all the structures on a lot. They are individual, but in GIS it kind of defaults to total for the lot. So what we're seeing at a high level is there's ranges of 500 square feet to 1,700 square feet. And if there's a garage on those lots, that's included in those. And that's on these red lots, the smallest lots. So, we have data if we really wanted to dive into seeing what the sizes of houses are. I mean, the data's there. It's time, if we want to go into great detail, to see what that information's telling us. I think in our conversations, we think, we want to have a sense of it, but we don't need to know the details of it. So that's where we're at on that, but on this map, you'll see the square footages on all the lots. You just have to keep in mind it's including garages, or if there's a shed also, that's gonna be in there too. And then we took this, and then we can calculate lot coverage, and you can see it on that map, but there's very few lots exceeding 30% today. Even the small lots, there's only about 4 of them that I can see, and they're not dramatically higher than 30% even. So with that, my interpretation of that is that the lot coverage standard's not an issue for existing small lots. So to me, it seems like that's a reason to think that having smaller lot standards is okay. That makes sense. Any questions about any of those numbers? Any surprises?
I have one question and one point of clarification. So what you're saying is we have a lot of lots where there's a lot of green space that's not being covered by a building. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So if we were talking about density, that's availability, is that?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then my other question is, how many lots do we really have available, I don't know if you know this number, that are developable? Like, how many lots that have access to sewer, water? Because we know we're not going any farther, but like, how many lots are really do we have that could be sold and you could put a house on them?
Well, we don't know the answer until we set the numbers. So if the width is 40 feet,
Yeah, if you're talking about how many legal existing 10,000 square foot, 75 foot wide residential lots are out there right now that could be built on,
Maybe a dozen,
I would say, yeah,
less than a dozen.
12 or less,
Okay, so we have 12.
probably less.
And so if
You have to think about
you're
the
using present code or present zoning?
Yeah, and the only reason they're not built on right now is because they're not for sale. Somebody owns it and wants to own it.
Sure. And people have the right to do it if they want.
Yep.
But if
So
you,
really, how many are for sale would be a better question. I
well,
think that answer is 0.
okay, so,
so maybe to help with that, last fall we made the map with these colors.
yeah,
So if it's, so if we went to 40 foot width, that's essentially, say, 5,000 square feet is the lot size around there. So that means anything that's light green or green or yellow on here, you could divide at least into 2 lots or more. So, of course, most of them have houses on them, but depending on where they're placed, if they're really large, there's probably room to cut it in half and create another lot. And of course, there's always redevelopment that, you want to
besides tearing things down and starting again. So like, if we have 12 lots, none of them are for sale, but if you change the zoning and you made it to the point where like, hey, we could cut this theoretically in half instead of 75 feet to 40,
Yeah.
then you could have like 24 pieces of property that possibly could be built on.
No, you could have 200. You know, because there's already a lot out there that's 75 feet wide. It's got a house on it.
Yep.
But maybe between the 4 houses on that block, there's 2 or 3 spaces where you could cut a 40-foot lot in, where there's a 40-foot lot for each house and a 40-foot lot of open space that doesn't exist right now as a lot of record, but could. And so that's the real power of reducing the lot width, is not finding vacant parcels that aren't big enough, but it's creating new parcels.
Right, and so like somebody, when you're saying that the people don't want to sell these, but they have the ability to subdivide it,
Yeah.
they could make some money on their investment, and then you could do things.
It's pretty rare that somebody holds on to one they can already subdivide and make some money on.
Right.
That's why there's less than 12, because that's happened already. And we've even started eating into the 60-foot lots and smaller, like the 8th Avenue ones Hal was talking about. So now the question is, if we move down to even smaller number, what becomes available? And it's not like every piece of 40-foot grass is gonna get a house built on it, because people are still gonna make their own choices about how to
Right,
use their
of course.
property. But there could potentially be hundreds of new opportunities then in the town.
Well, great.
Just by the map, the light green ones, in theory, could be divided in half. The dark green ones could be divided into 3, and the yellow ones could be divided into 4 or more.
Okay.
I mean, that's just the numbers, without looking at what's exactly on there. So,
In most cases, that's the maximizing of it, which we couldn't do because there's gonna be a structure probably centered on those lots, but not always.
yeah, I mean, you start digging in and you're gonna find things that you're like, oh, look at this one has potential. and-
Yeah.
Well, that would be the scene of the name of our game, isn't it? Like, trying to create
Yep.
as many opportunities as we can.
Well, I think it's called, yeah, it's the opportunities, because, as Mike said, just because
Of course.
it might exist out there,
Yeah.
doesn't mean the owner of that property is interested in doing anything with
Right.
it, but that's not to say that somewhere down the line, might be a new owner, different interests, might change. But if we don't ever change the regulations, obviously that opportunity
Right.
is not there, so.
So when you were doing your research, did you look at ones that are not going to work? And they're colored, they're saying, well, maybe someday.
Yeah, that'd be
But
interesting. How many, yeah, like
Because that's what I spent my weekend doing, is going through the map saying, okay,
Yeah.
where could we? And I did our homes sitting here around this table, wouldn't work.
Well, mine wouldn't. My lot's 60 by 90. I mean,
Right, so.
you maybe got a little, but you've already got another structure on
You've got
your
your
the garage.
structure, yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, I can
I'm
put-
looking like,
I can put
okay,
one in my
we could
backyard.
divide, but no,
I'm
it
not gonna-
wouldn't.
I don't want to do that.
It really wouldn't, so I'm wondering how many really, unless you were gonna do a tear down, I guess.
because the house is centered right in
Right.
the middle. Ah, well, yeah, that's an important
Yeah.
consideration, because we're not going anywhere if we're not,
I mean,
But maybe you could build like I was gonna say an ancillary building,
Well, that was like,
accessory dwelling
yeah,
unit,
I was like, okay, it could fit here, but I just wondered how
Yeah.
many
yeah, I mean,
we're talking.
that's an exercise that can be done. I don't know if we've agreed that that's what we want to do, but, I mean,
I don't know if.
You can start putting boxes on-
Counting helps us. We've not established a goal in terms of number. So if we did have a goal, we want to increase the housing supply by X, then we might want to go count to figure out what this ought to be. But if our goal is just increase the housing supply, then it doesn't really matter how many are available at whatever
Right.
number we pick.
I was just trying to cost analyze this whole
yeah.
well, what, I'm
process
just-
here. How much are we really
Well-
investing and what will we potentially get?
Right.
And I'm hoping those numbers work out, but when I'm picking
What-
and choosing, I'm like,
What are you hoping to see?
Yeah, that's the question. Like, what would be a reasonable
Well, that's
increase
what,
in density?
I don't know, we haven't talked about what number are we all hoping to get? I don't know. I want more than 12.
100, I mean, is 100 reasonable? That you would
Well, I
create-
think we want maximum, is what we want.
So
And
two-
we don't know what that is. I think that we
Yeah.
start changing our rules so that we're moving in the direction of more,
Well,
because there
the-
are gonna be people who are gonna say, no, I'm not gonna subdivide, I'm
Right.
not gonna do that. But then there are gonna be other people like, yeah, sure, why not? Or maybe not me, but then my son.
Well, wait a second, I mean, those are individual choices that people will make, and they can
Right,
make
and
those
we're
right, but
making-
I'm saying, like, if you, I mean, like, if you created the potential and you could say,
Yes.
this is what you could do it or not, it's your choice.
Yeah.
But like, we can, I mean, based on these dimensions, you know, we could at least create the potential for some, you know, so I mean,
Right.
we can determine what we'd want as a maximum.
I think I don't think we need to do that. I think we create the rules that allow people to make
Of course,
more.
of course, I
And then
mean,
we just let it roll.
yeah,
And we
well,
make
that's
sure
how
that
it's
we-
gonna be, but I'm just saying,
Right.
I mean, but like,
But I think trying to come up with a maximum number is not worth the effort. I think what we do is we make sure that our rules are going to encourage people to have
right.
more.
I think you and I are on the same point, I think we're
Right.
just seeing it from
You want a
different-
number, I don't need a number.
Well, I think what you wanna do is you wanna be able to say, like, look, we are dedicated to.
Increasing housing.
Increasing housing.
Yeah.
If we make these zoning changes, theoretically, we could create 200 new dwellings on this property. Are you gonna sell your property and divide it into 4 pieces? No. Okay, well, you don't have to.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's not like we have to push for these 200.
Right.
But I mean, that's what I'm talking about, like,
Yeah.
if you
So it
create
isn't
these
like-
rules,
Okay.
this would be the greatest number that could be achieved.
Well,
That is really hard to come up with that
Yeah.
greatest number that could be achieved.
Because then we could talk about knockdowns, like, okay, yeah, well, if every house was
Yeah.
knocked down and we split them all up.
And that will happen in some
Sure.
circumstances. Somebody will take advantage to redevelop a poor conditioned structure into
Well,
multiple
the
units.
joints property.
Yeah.
The structure was removed,
Yeah.
and, you know, what that ultimately might end up as, I mean, I don't think we know, but certainly with the opportunities that are available today, there's limitations on what could be allowed on that site. But, you know, as Jeff presented at our last meeting, all the different housing style options, I mean, it could be anything from apartment buildings to condominiums to
Right, you'd have to
these,
choose which
cottage-
one's gonna go
cottage
on which
communities
property,
to
yeah.
single-family homes and
Yeah.
duplexes, I mean, whatever, and, I mean, you don't know what somebody's thoughts or plans might be. I mean, if people started adding accessory second dwellings on their properties because they had the square footage to do that, you know, is that something, I mean, you wouldn't just up total numbers of potential homes by the number of homes in town, I mean, that's pretty unlikely. I mean, I think setting numbers is, you know, not the game we're in, but
I'm not-
making the opportunity
Right.
available to let people make some decisions that might provide for the ability to have more housing
Yeah.
and more
Yes.
options in housing.
Is
So
the
to the-
idea of the number a way to communicate what's happening? Is that?
I don't know, I mean, when you talk to the public, I mean,
Yeah.
like, when you go back and you try to make sense of this, you know,
Mhm.
like, hey, we're gonna create this zone, you have this piece of property, if we rezone it, or if we change the rules like this, you have the potential to do these things with it,
Mhm.
you know?
I mean,
Yes, I've
and
gotten
we
that
could-
question from the public. Well, you're spending all this time and effort and money, what is it really gonna get us? And I'm like, well, I think it's gonna increase our housing availability.
Yeah.
Well, how much?
Affordable.
I mean,
Well,
if
I
you-
don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
that almost gets,
that's what made me go and look at the map saying, oh, I don't know the
Well,
number.
ask them the same question we asked you. What do they want?
I think it always creates a level of fear, though, if you throw out a number that says, oh yeah, we have the ability to create an additional 200 housing units.
Yes, that is.
And everybody says, 200 more housing
Because they're
units.
thinking about it
That-
right
that-
around them.
Yeah, and it's, where's that gonna
Yes.
go?
I don't want
Where-
that next to me. Yeah.
Well,
That's what I, yeah.
so
Well,
I,
I think, again, I recommend that every opportunity we have to take that head on, we have to. Which is, if we're gonna add more density, it's going to create uncomfortable situations with people, but it's just will. I mean, we know that people have that concern, they've shared it with us many times. If we're gonna add more units, though, if that's our goal, that's the cost. And so we have to be willing as a community to pay that price to add more housing.
And the challenge with zoning is it can't predict the market, so,
Right.
No,
you know, you can look at, I mean, I noticed in here, you know, projections for Grand Marais. If you just look at people, it'd say it's not gonna grow number of people. But we've seen in lots of communities where the growth isn't happening or it's stable. Number of households is going up right now because the demographics are changing. So
Yeah.
there's a lot more 1 and 2 family or 2-person households. As people get older, they're smaller. And so
Yeah.
the number of households can go up even though the population doesn't go up. And that's a
Yeah.
certain type of housing that you're looking for. It's, you know, it might be courtyard houses are attractive. Doesn't mean every lot can fit those.
There's so many factors in, that put the brakes on significant housing growth. Even if we open up all of the barriers that we can with rules,
Yeah.
we can't create 10 more house building crews in town. You know, they might show up if those opportunities exist and the market's demanding it, but
Yeah.
it, you know, the busiest years we've had are 5, 6 new houses. So this is still gonna be incremental when it comes to new
Yeah.
single-family homes.
Of course.
Yep.
Even if we tripled that rate, you know, it's still not like 200 houses are gonna show
You
up
know, to
tomorrow.
your point about cost, though, I think we already know that we are paying a cost right now of what we don't have because we don't have housing. We have people show up and leave because they can't find housing. Or
Right.
people don't come back because they can't afford it. And fair enough.
Yeah, well.
So
and
we're
your co-
already paying a cost. So
your
it's
co-
not like we're getting away from it. And people have already told us, yeah, we don't want to keep paying that cost. So here's the other side of that.
And it's the shape of the community. I mean, like, is it gonna be all, you know, do you want just complete retirement, or do you want families, you want employees, you want, you know, yeah.
But today the code is really catering only to large lot, single-family homes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing else that it's really encouraging,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I think it was a suburban standard that was incorporated into our ordinance when it was adopted in the early 70s, and, you know,
Yeah.
it seemed like at that time,
Bloomington.
I call it Plymouth, but Plymouth didn't
Oh, Plymouth.
exist in 1970, so it, you know, it probably was Bloomington.
Or Richfield.
And that's
Yeah.
why we're here, because we
Yeah.
know it doesn't work.
So our goal is to change this table into something that's
Wow.
more supportive of other housing types. We've talked about, these are the current standards that are out there. So we're gonna focus on these this afternoon. So I'm gonna jump right into them. So side yard setbacks. So if you want if you want smaller lots, the most significant thing about that is to reduce the width of the lot. To reduce the width of the lot, means that you have to look at the side yard setbacks, which, looking at precedents of, you know, at in other cities, 10 feet isn't huge. It's not like it's, you know, overly restrictive, but there are cities that have 5-foot setbacks too. So what is the purpose of side yard setbacks? That's the area that you might have drainage and utility easements. We looked at Grand Marais' subdivision ordinance. It says lots are supposed to have those. Lots of them don't, right?
We don't have them anywhere unless the street right-of-way is not 66 feet wide.
Yeah, so, you know, they can be, let's say they're typically 5 or 10 feet when people subdivide land, but that they often are in the side yards. You want light and air to your house, in between your house and whatever's next to you. Can be for privacy between residences. It can be exterior access to the rear yard. It can be for exterior parking and or a driveway. Could be for trash storage. So how could that be reduced? Again, that's a main way of reducing lot widths. We did not measure current setbacks. And as you probably know, there's houses that are really close to the property lines on the sides.
Yep.
I actually live in a house that's so close to our neighbor's tree that everybody thinks that tree is our tree, but it's not. It's just really close to our house. So I think one thing to consider is to go to a 5-foot on each side. Another alternative is to have a combined 10-foot, 5-foot each side, but allow some flexibility. So if you want to have more space on one side of a house and not the other one, it could be bigger on one side.
And that would adjust to like structures that are already there.
Well, that's the trick about making it variable probably is, it could. If the house next to you is not very close to you, you could make it a smaller setback on that side. Or if they are close to you, make yours bigger.
You don't necessarily want to have people be able to make decisions about how the neighbor gets to use their property in the future, though.
Yeah,
I got you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that should come into consideration though is that when you start to create more compact lots, you also have to think about, building design is more critical to the site. And of course, here we have slopes and things like that, the orientation of the home, in the current practice is generally as you orient the broad side of your house to the street, maybe it's, or a reorientation of the narrow side of the house to the street. Maybe you don't have that attached garage that's, creates the L-shaped structure, but I think building, home design comes into play. I mean, I'd still like to see maintenance of of what I think would be a reasonable side setback, because I think some of these things that you talk about, like light and air, the privacy, the ability to move from the front to the back of the property along, the side of the home, those are all important to be included in that. And I think the idea of having it be somewhat flexible is good, but I was thinking maybe more along the line of 15 feet with no less than 5 feet on one side to make sure you still, you're not just, creating a 40-foot lot and letting people build up to within, 3 feet of the property line.
So what we're talking about is a minimum, so if it was 5, and so today it's 10.
Yeah.
If it was 5, it wouldn't mean that somebody has to be 5 feet away. They could be 20 feet away if they wanted to. It just
But I was
makes
thinking
the
of
lot
on a
size
40,
go up.
40-foot lot, if you say at a 24-foot home, oriented on that lot, that gives you, 16 feet to work with.
Yeah,
If, so you could have 10 feet on one side and 6 feet on the other and still fit that 24-foot structure on that lot.
yeah.
If you start to get to, I mean, I suppose you could narrow it down, but then, I think you start to give I think you start to create problems for yourself by allowing homes that are too wide for the particular lot. I mean, if they had a 50-foot lot, it might not be an issue, but if they're looking at the smallest size lot, that might be buildable. Maybe it comes with, a little bit more challenges, but challenges that can be, overcome with proper, site design.
What problems?
Well, like orientation of the structure. I mean, if you have a 30-foot wide building, a 24 by 30-foot building or a 32-foot building, and you want to orient it the 32 feet to the street, well, that doesn't give you, it only gives you 8 feet left over.
Yeah.
But if you do orient it the other direction, it's just a matter of how you design your home to fit on that lot to still accomplish providing these, what I think are needed, space between the side yard and the home.
There's plenty of neighborhoods in the universe now
Yeah.
where there aren't any setbacks, where they're crowded in tight. There's even neighborhoods in this town where our buildings are right next to each other, and they don't do those things. Or those things are accomplished with other tools. So we really wanted to try and populate this list with what is the purpose of a setback? If we're trying to figure out what's the minimum width we're willing to live with, what are we giving up by moving down to a smaller number than 10?
So if-
And what, you know, which of these are we willing to give up versus which of these do we say, no, we really need to maintain these?
Well, I think that the privacy and space between residences is more critical than the need for air and light between a garage and a neighbor's garage, you know. I don't see you needing to have 10 feet of separation between the property line and your garage to the neighbor, where the neighbor's gonna build their garage, to have 20 foot of space in between.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, seems like kind of a useless space, you know.
So for you, and when we're talking about this, are we only talking about the buildings themselves, or the homes themselves? Or
I
are we
think
talking-
whatever you want to talk about.
Whatever, any
Okay.
building, any building.
Okay, because I mean, obviously, when it comes to the garages, I agree with you, but I also think that the idea of leaving things a little more open I think there is a natural point that we hit in terms of the way people build and in terms of the housing that people are willing to occupy. And there are things such as fences or what have you, like grow some vines up here or whatever to block it. And I'm not saying that I don't see distance as a great thing to have as in terms of privacy, but there are other means to get to that. And I think that, I don't know, I mean, I just don't see a lot of like going all the way to the edge. And I know that, that's where you're seeing it, like somebody's gonna do that. Some people are gonna do that. I'm
Well,
not sure that's gonna be the norm.
Just looking at his, looking at that, right now we're currently at 10 feet. If we reduce it to 5, is that a problem? Would you have a and it would fit
Me
your
personally.
idea of like the 6 and the 10,
And
It
I
would
guess
be
what I'm
5 on each
posing,
lot, so it's really 10 feet in between
yeah,
the two buildings.
and to me, that seems sufficient, at least.
So
But then I'm wondering,
what
And
about,
you're right.
I've got a
You could-
20-foot wall I need to paint. And I've got a 5-foot piece of yard to use to maintain that. And, I can't even put a ladder there on my yard. I'm requiring the use of my neighbor's yard
And
now.
when your neighbor puts his fence up, or you put your fence up because you don't wanna see your neighbor,
Yeah,
then it becomes,
this already exists in town. I mean, this isn't a new problem.
In the city of Minneapolis, you live there, 10 foot, they're together, that's it. And a lot of houses on one block,
Yeah.
and it worked out pretty good, except you could always look in the kitchen and see what somebody's eating when I grew up in a bungalow in South Minneapolis. But it worked, and it got, years ago, in the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the prices were lower around the country. And there's two things that we've got to consider when we're talking about doing this, is the economic structure here. Right now, I've told that if you go over $700 a month, it's very difficult for people to afford it here. We have some public bodies, the hospital and the school, pay good wages, but that's not true in the businesses around town. It's $10 an hour, and it's very difficult to economically do anything with that kind of a job. And that is a problem.
and I feel like just creating more opportunity, again, getting back to what we're talking about. And I just, I think it's fine to have a minimum, but I do question having a minimum.
So then the other question is, just practically, where do I put my propane tank?
Yep.
How is it physically installed? How does that equipment get to that piece of property? How's it filled? How do I get the hose to it? And so now, if you've got a 40-foot lot and the propane tank's in the back, and you haven't left room for a truck to get through, and there's plenty of lots like that exist, there needs to be an alternative, and that's where we
Well,
talk
I've
about
got
the
it.
alley.
Yeah, well.
If there's an alley access-
We have an alley.
If there's a constructed alley that's being used, that's capable of accessing the backyards,
Yeah.
then suddenly the need for a full 10-foot setback doesn't seem quite as important.
Right. So I have a question about
Not yet.
the combined 10 feet. So could I choose to put all 10 feet on one side and build right up to the line, and my neighbor below me does the same thing, and we're right like this? Are we saying that's okay?
So,
There are cities that do that. I'm not recommending it, but it
So we
would
would need a
allow.
bit-
That would be that alternative, I think, approach, and I think,
Okay, so we would still say
So
some on each
So the
side.
standard could either be it's 5 feet, both sides, or it's 6 feet or 8 feet, whatever. It's the
Mhm.
same on each side. Or it could be, it's a combined number, and then there's a minimum. So instead of,
Okay,
if it's 10, it's gotta be at least 3. So it could be 6 and 4, or 3 and 7, or 5 and 5.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have some level of setback, just because of maintenance issues, stormwater runoff, I mean, you've got, you don't have gutters, and water runs off into your neighbor's property, I mean, that's not acceptable either. So there's gotta be some way to take care and maintain that side of the
Right,
home.
and the setback is one strategy, where it's more of a passive, hopefully we're gonna let all that stuff take care of itself strategy. Another strategy is we try and figure out what all those things are, and there's a regulation that says, when you have plans for a house, you have to show us what your drainage plan is. And that's pretty common. I mean, the county's doing that right now. Where are you gonna put the water? And if they've got a strategy that works, then, and the setback's not needed for that, what are we requiring it for? So if they can get into the backyard, we're not worried about light and air, there's a fence for privacy, they've shown us how the drainage is gonna work, they've got off-street parking, as, identified, running out of reasons why we would wanna require a setback. I don't know if it works to not require one, but I think it's interesting to just think about it.
is our goal tonight to start putting some numbers down in pencil? I mean, is that a reason?
If you've got a number that you want to see, then that would be great. Our goal tonight is to discuss these issues and just kind of see where we're at with them.
Well, theoretically, then we're talking about making lots, maybe reducing the required width, and if we do, then you would probably, common sense would say you would reduce the minimum setback. Is that fair?
That's the main way you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if we should go through the
Yeah.
rest of them too.
I mean, I'm just like,
Because we've only
10 to
just-
5,
we've
I
only just
can-
taken out
yeah,
one
yeah.
of the items
Yeah, let's
so
talk about
far.
the next one.
But we're getting good at it now, so it'll go faster.
Oh, sure,
Well,
okay.
so to keep it in perspective, from my standpoint, I think the width is the key thing. So I think if there's an opportunity to reduce side yard setbacks, that helps, because what else are you gonna do to affect that? You can't say, you can't say the minimum, you could say there's a minimum building or a maximum building size, but, because you're kind of going towards a maximum width related to the width of the lot, right? And there's
Well, my experience has been, people will push the limits to the extreme, to the extent that they can.
Right.
And so, assuming that that's what people will try to do.
That's the envelope, right?
Then,
Yeah.
then those are the numbers that you're working, I mean, yes, there'll be some that will, be thoughtful and, think about it themselves and not just look at the ordinance and say, this is what it allows, so I guess I only need a 40-foot lot and I can have 5 feet on either
Yeah.
side and I'll build a house 30 foot in the middle.
So let's talk about the street yard. So the current minimum is 25 feet. And we didn't measure these because we have to do that one by one, but there's a mix. There's some that are, right up to the street. I'd say most are setbacks, 25 or around there. So what's the purpose of the front or the street yard setback? Again, it can't be for drainage and utilities easements. Space for a building entry, front stoop, porch, space for trees, landscaping, or a transition buffer area from the street sidewalk. So it's kind of a privacy thing too. How could it be reduced? A lot of places that we looked at, it talks about aligning the setback with the average of the existing setbacks on that block. So I think what's good about that is there's probably not a magic number. I mean, 25 feet, I don't know if that's the magic number anywhere, but if you align with the existing setbacks, you're not infringing on anybody else's views or enjoyment of their front yard. So that's one way you can do it, and there are cities that do that. Another way to do is to say, if they vary on a block, allow the house to go up as close to the sidewalk or the street as the closest one. So, it's already varied, and there's not a magic number, unless people feel strongly about it should be at least 15 feet or 25 feet. So just give that flexibility that you can go as close to the street as somebody else has done on that block. Another one would be just to reduce it below 25, because we feel like that's too big, and, we've talked about, you could go out and measure, take time, but you could measure, like, what is kind of the typical setback on some of these blocks in Grand Marais, and say should really be 15 or 20. It doesn't significantly change what the minimum lot size would be, I wouldn't say.
I think especially in the existing platted area of the city, where the lots are already laid out to be, for the most part, 130, 135 feet deep
Yeah.
already. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a pressing issue.
Yeah.
There's a lot of 3 instead of 2 on the streets across the short side of a block.
Yeah, on the streets, yeah.
So wherever you're talking about the avenues and the houses are, the front door is at the avenue,
Right.
even a 40-foot width, this 25-foot setback I don't think it's a problem either. It doesn't, there's not a lot of people inside of that. But along the streets where you go 3 wide, now there's a lot of people that are inside of it.
Yes.
Pretty common. I mean, look at the MacArthur house. They're certainly well within inside of it. I know I am. I don't think there's even 10 feet between our living room and the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue. So,
Yeah, I think in the older developed parts of the city, you go on any of the streets and you probably find half the structures are less than that 25 foot.
so I have a hard time thinking like, why do we need a front yard setback at all, other than some predictability in terms of access to views on the lots that are above you. And it would be a dirty trick for us to make this 0, and then somebody sticks a house in the middle of an avenue that, where there wasn't allowed to be one before. If, somebody can do that right now, and, we don't own our views, we don't own the property rights of somebody else's property. If they can build a 35-foot structure in a house that's right next to us, right now, but at least we have some predictability about where that is. And it seems like the front yard's more about views than anything
Well, I
else.
think it's that transition buffer from the street sidewalk to the development. I mean, downtown, we've talked about wanting to make sure we push buildings out to the street to get that pedestrian, commercial interface, where I think in residential areas, that's what you want to eliminate, is that pedestrian, residence interface. You want to have a transition from that.
It's the opposite conversation of somebody's renting a room on Wisconsin with their bedroom windows on the main floor.
Yeah.
So, listening to you, Mike, then, are you hypothetically proposing then you would just set a minimum distance? You just set a 25, maybe you go 15?
Well, I
or-
don't know if I would mess with it too much, and I don't know if we need to, but more importantly, the tools that we would need to use to manage the issue of views, like he's offering the first bullet point, how could it be reduced, is really the way to do that. And I think that's just way too complex for us to get into. And it gets away from, it's easy to understand our ordinance. When we say, well, you're gonna have to go out and measure the setbacks of all your neighbors on the block, and then, like, well, no, this is getting complex now. And every block's got a different setback, and
So that's why you're just saying, pick a number, just leave it at 25?
pick a number, leave it at 25, make it 20 or 15, but,
Got it.
understand what's at
Yes.
stake is the views, but this one doesn't seem quite as critical to me.
Well, and I think that we need to be careful too, in that we're not locking ourselves into just the established subdivided area of the city, because when you start to think about potential for new development, and we did that with Anton's development up in Creechville, where we took a large tract of land that was basically raw land, not subdivided, well, it was, but, but re-subdivided it, and, to encumber him with standards that apply to the, kind of the core area of the city, probably doesn't make a lot of sense, and there, I mean, I think of other potential areas for development that don't have sewer water that might be outside of the subdivided area. I think you have to allow for that creativity to happen and not be kind of encumbered by this concept that we've had this, you know.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I know it does maybe throw a monkey in the wrench, as you're saying, you know, to have to go and measure, but I think it makes sense too. Like, and I think people would go like, oh, okay, that makes sense, that the front of my house has to be in alignment with most of the houses on my block.
But what would Anton have done? Who
Well,
would
and
he
see,
have
and
measured?
see, that's what I'm saying, like, that would leave him open to be more creative. and
So we
open
can
for
say
this
it's
and-
10 feet or
Or the
the average of what's existing. I mean, there's
I think-
some way to
I
writ
think you'd
that.
want to
Yeah.
have
Yeah,
a
that's what I
minimum,
think.
because I don't think we want to see homes built right up to the,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, it's not the curb line, but
Okay.
the sidewalk, could be a sidewalk there, or
Yeah.
it just might be just a boulevard, but still.
So,
Yeah.
just so
No, I
I
gotcha.
understand, if we reduce that setback, that would have allowed Anton even more creativity, is that what we're saying?
I think so, although I don't think the setback is really an issue for him. And I don't even think any of our rules were an issue for him because of the particular way he builds houses. He's not looking for tiny lots and
It
so
seems
it's
like
tough to see how, I mean, I've told him, look, this is coming. You haven't done your final plat yet. You might want to just wait and see how this turns out. And maybe you want to make some changes, but I don't think he does. So, will somebody else come and look at an existing platted lot, though, if we allow 40-foot lots and say, now it makes a lot more sense to extend water and sewer with my own money because I think the investment will pay off? Maybe. And then we have to think about, okay, what is the setback supposed to be on a new block, above Third Street on 10th Avenue or something like that?
Well, the issue of, things like off-street parking, when you start to talk about smaller lots, I mean, if you want to build a garage on your property and you have a 40-foot lot, either you have to have an alley that's going to provide you access, or you're going to have to build that garage to front off the street, or provide enough room to get around your house to get to the back of the lot to get into a garage. And again,
Yeah.
these are design considerations that, somebody's going to have to make when they start to think about this. But not all options or opportunities are going to be available for every 40-foot lot.
Right.
So,
Right, I think where the average thing and the option for smaller setbacks would be these, I don't know what your house is, Mike, but I think, does it face south?
It faces south and east.
yeah,
South,
depends.
So
Yeah.
I think it's these, it's.
There it
yeah, it's
is.
these
Yep.
Here,
No, that's Mike's.
oh, that's right.
The other way.
So, wherever these blocks are, or these lots are not east-west, if they're gonna fill in or redevelop, I mean, you have more leeway on what the depth is, so if doesn't have to be 140 or 135, it could be 120 or 100, then the smaller front yard setback gives you more room to build. If you don't need a full 25, because that's not the magic number in Grand Marais.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, my assumption is that views will be the most sensitive issue when we talk about this setback. But we may try to figure out a way to test that out with some people.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I like the idea of the minimum and then average.
Yeah, yeah.
Say like, hey, we want to keep it all within what is already happening, but if there's nothing happening, then.
So we can bring that line.
Why would you have that language? I mean, if you have a minimum, and you don't want to put it there, you can just put it anywhere you want. You can go back any more than you want. I mean, like,
Because
why do you have?
you might not want somebody to go to that minimum if all the homes are sitting back 25 feet.
And then you have
a
one
minimum of
that's-
10 feet, and you're saying, no, we don't want, if the average is 25 feet, we want you to be in line with the rest of those, not the 10 feet.
We can bring you some language,
That's
'cause
right.
that's the
Yeah.
I see
complexity
what
that
you're
Mike's
saying.
talking
Yeah,
about.
so
Right.
like,
So for homes that are already existing.
Yeah,
right, or if you want to plunk down, like, oh, now we've gotten rid of this, we now have some room to plunk a house in between these two houses, you can't be up here, you have to be back where they are.
yeah.
A lot of the activity this is going to generate is remodeling existing structures. And so then this question's going to be right there. And this is always the thing that a remodeling runs into is the setback.
Yeah. all right, let's do the next one. The rear yard, it's 25 feet. Kind of the same things, other than the backyard's probably where, you know, a likely place for exterior parking or a detached garage and or an accessory dwelling unit. Not that you have to plan space for all those things, because some people aren't gonna have any of those things in their backyard, right?
Right.
So you can't force that, or you probably don't want to force that. Privacy between residences, less so, especially if there's an alley. But, I mean, 25 feet is bigger than like the 5 or 10 we were talking about on the side yard. And that's typically where the private open space is, or the yard, so how could that be reduced if you wanted to reduce that? You know, it impacts lot depth, so that lot depth could be smaller, but as I said before, I don't think that's a big opportunity area, other than on those north or south facing lots, it could be. So what could you do? You could reduce the minimum setback below 25 feet, because you think that's too big. I just don't feel like it's a big deal to change. I probably wouldn't focus on this one. I don't know if anybody has feelings about that.
I would say if you're gonna change the minimum on the front yard setback, just do the same thing on the backyard setback, and don't worry about the averaging piece of it. This, you know, lets people decide where on the lot makes sense for them physically to put the structure, where to put the parking, where to put the, do they need a yard to play in or not? I mean, those things can all be determined by the market probably more effectively than us legislating them. And there's a lot of existing structures out there that have options for people to choose from too, so I think the market will help kind of figure out, do I want a backyard or do I not need a backyard? Is it more a productive use of that to be a structure with residents in it?
I don't know, I've seen a lot of lots where I see people with a lot of backyard, and like, you could put something back there.
Mhm.
And so that, like, to me, that's potential density. So I don't know why you would not want to change that. You know, like, I think where I used to live next to you, I mean, that'd be a great backyard. You could do all kinds of things back there. And there's sort of an alley, but it's not really there anymore. And there's a
Right.
lot of people who all have their garages all kind of, you know, they're all backed up, and there's probably about 10 feet between each other. You know, like, why would you
Here's something
not
to
want to use
consider.
that spot?
Those garages are generally accessory uses, and we don't have accessory dwelling unit language, but we do have garden shed language. And we let those be 2.5 feet from side or back yards right now. So if there's gonna be an accessory dwelling unit and it's gonna be put in an existing garage structure, and that's a pretty typical sort of remodeling, it might be on a structure that's already 2.5 feet from the property line in the backyard. So
So-
maybe we wanna just walk away from that setback altogether.
One thing you want to think about, guys, is snow removal. And I will say that because I'm sure most of you know where I'm at. We have a huge, nice backyard, but snow removal becomes an issue. And there's an alley my husband maintains. And then where you push all those big snow piles and the drainage issue comes spring.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Where does it go? Neighbor's property,
across the street,
down the alley?
yeah, goes right over there.
So I think this one's less of a priority personally, but let's get through them all and then we can come
Okay.
back. So lot width is currently 75, we're talking about reducing that. I don't know, Mike can chime in, but I think the whole reason that there's a minimum lot width is because of density.
Yeah, I think so.
don't think there's anything magic about 75 feet.
Well, it is magic, it's powerful, I mean, it's
Yeah.
really
Oh, yeah.
controlled our access to this property
Yeah.
in a meaningful way. It's created the character, particularly of all the development that's occurred since 1970, which, you know, there's a lot of. And it's typical suburban, which is not a good way for us to economically use our utilities.
So ways that it could be reduced is consider the widths of existing small lots, which we've started to talk about. So, it looks like there's a lot of lots that are 40 feet wide. So doesn't mean that the new minimum is 40. It could be 45 or 50 if you feel like, even though there's a lot of those 40s, maybe that's too small. Maybe it should be 45 or 50. But I think knowing that there is a fair number of 40-foot lots helps make that decision. It's impacted by the side yard setback minimum. It's impacted by the location of parking, whether that's outdoor or a driveway to a rear detached garage, because if the garage is attached to the house, I mean, we're not controlling that. But, and then, this has come up before, if there's access to an alley, that would eliminate the need for parking or a driveway in that side yard, which would allow the lot to be narrower. And I don't know if Mike wants to talk about the alley, but the alley can be termed infrastructure, right?
Yeah, and it's not the only one. It's the one that's kind of come up a lot because parking has been an issue that is always talked about in this setting. And our rules about parking are pretty elegant in the residential zone right now. You have to provide a certain amount per number of units you've got. And we don't tell you how you have to do it or where you have to do it. You just have to do it off-street. And
In any of the yard. I mean, it could be front, side, or back.
could be, yeah, it could be front, side, back, anywhere, off
Kelly?
street. And leaving it that way means if we said a 40-foot lot is allowed, then they can figure out whatever way is possible to put the parking on it. And, we don't have to set a rule that guarantees that everybody can find parking in a particular strategy, like a big setback or access to the backyard or making sure there's an alley. We could just allow for all those variety of ways to be used. This one's the conversations that have occurred here at the board. As a staff person, it makes it hard for me to think, like, what should the minimum be? I can't think of a small number that you're going to tell me is nuts, because you're talking about the goal, which is add more units. So then how do we figure out what the right stopping point is on that? It's hard to do. I don't know if I think there should be one either.
Well, yeah, I look at, some of the higher density development, in town, and, some of the homes are on 25-foot lots, some are on 40-foot lots. They seem and feel like they're appropriate.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if they're all on 25-foot lots, if it would seem appropriate, but I think what happens is, because the way the city was platted and developed early on, you have some of these 25-foot lots, but the neighbor might have a 75-foot lot. They bought 2 or 3 lots, and, even the 40-foot lots, there might be an 80-foot lot. So they may have bought 2 40-foot lots, and plopped their home right in the middle of it. And
Yeah.
so I'm not as concerned about the small size until we get to a totally undeveloped site, and then you start to think about, what is the density that you really want for a raw site, and how does that look different than our subdivided portion of towns, where you
Yeah.
might see infill, or somebody breaking off or splitting off a portion of their parcel to provide an additional, lot. And I think there's a difference there. And
Yeah, I mean, so far, we're trying to stay clear of new areas, right? Because we started to talk about blocks at the last meeting.
We're not focusing on them, but if we change the rules enough, it may allow the market to access some of these difficult-to-build areas.
Right.
It may make that investment in new infrastructure pay off, if you could put 15 houses on a block instead of 8.
Yeah.
And then it's time to think about the question you're talking about. The density that exists now on First Avenue West going up the hill is pretty high. But First Avenue West has sidewalks on both sides of the street, has new water and sewer pipes and pavement in good condition, things that can handle a lot of density. You look at the new One Roof housing development and imagine them on 40-foot lots, and suddenly there's 20 houses on that block instead of 8. But it's on a gravel road with no sidewalks, and the water and sewer is fine, but not anything else about the infrastructure down there is fine. So then we have to figure out, how do we write that in, if we're gonna allow 40-foot lots, which I think makes a lot of sense in the developed neighborhoods, how do we ensure that there's adequate infrastructure for a new block, so that we don't let somebody take advantage and build something that other neighborhoods have to absorb, but they're not capable of absorbing? A lot of places now, and our subdivision ordinance does this too, basically says the city engineer has to figure that out. So any proposed new plat, the city engineer has to evaluate it based on what sort of traffic's gonna be there, what kind of pedestrian access do we want. Well, we don't really have one, so this
Well,
would
and
be difficult for us.
Even if you take one roof housing and you said, oh, sure, they can put sidewalks in, but then what happens? Where do they go
Where do
from the
they go?
sidewalk on the development? There is no sidewalk down the whole street anywhere.
Right. So now
you know,
if we add a few conditions and get back to making sure that the infrastructure we've got is suitable, but also making regulations that protect our values, safety of traffic and pedestrians is definitely one of our values. There has to be some regulation that gets built in to account for allowing new density in undeveloped areas, that says that you have to pay for the upsizing of all the infrastructure that's required to get to you to serve that space. We've got a pedestrian plan, so we can say, okay, if you're on the pedestrian routes now, then you can access this density, and if you're not, then you can access this density. We could do something like that.
So typically, the subdivision ordinance would help you do that. You're saying yours isn't very helpful.
I mean, a lot of subdivision ordinances leave that up to some individual evaluation by an engineer.
Yeah.
And that's what ours says, but we don't have a staff engineer, we have contract engineer, and frankly, that would be a barrier to most people looking at developing new.
Yeah.
But maybe that's okay.
Yeah, maybe it's okay, but we have to be ready to answer those questions too, if we make these rules, because we will create some pressure.
Well, I mean, I think the starting point of this conversation is what are the lot widths that we think are reasonable and acceptable, and I mean, I still think you're right, going back to that 40-foot width seems to be a starting point for this conversation. Now, I don't know if that's the ending point, but, at sometime we have to make sure that, we're gonna put a number out there that the community is gonna be able to react to. And I mean, I don't think it's us deciding this, making this decision, it's the community deciding to make this decision, and how, where we end up with it. I mean, it's gonna be based on, I think, what kind of input we get from the community.
Well, I think right now we're assuming that there's one residential district that allows a mix of housing types, but I do see cities that have smaller lots allowed in the older part of their town and not quite as small in the growing area. So it wouldn't be 40 versus 75, but maybe it's 40 versus a number that you're more comfortable with, whether it's 50 or, something
But
a
I
little
mean,
bit bigger.
We do want density, but we do want more housing, too. So I think, I'm just saying, I don't want to spoil the milk too much. I don't mind putting a little bit of a something out there, you got to pony up some dough if you want to do this.
Yeah.
I don't mind that, but keeping a standard, I think it's fair, and that's fair play.
We already require, we'll just say Anton, because he's the latest version of this. He's paying full freight. He's paying for the engineering, he's paying for the construction. I mean, everything that's happening up there is his money. And it's not the community that's doing that. I think that's just a given. If somebody's gonna do a new development, that we're not participating financially in their development, at least initially. But now we're gonna own it, right? But it's the piece between what we already own and maintain and what they're building? And are they creating an impact on other existing infrastructure that it wasn't designed to handle? And when we look at the edges of the community where these lots exist to be new lots at 40 feet wide, it's the edges that don't have the infrastructure ready to handle all that
But what if it
traffic.
gets developed and
But
then
then-
our net tax capacity raises and
Right, I mean, I was just gonna
We
say, I mean, that's what we want.
invest in our
I mean, as a
community.
community, we said we want this.
Let's, no
That's a
new
cost.
parks, let's invest in
Yeah,
sidewalks.
That's one of our costs.
it is.
That's-
It's yeah. I'm not saying we can't do it. I was literally struggling to find a reason to say we should have a minimum lot width at all. Let's figure out like what's the basis of having a density requirement, and that's the best I got. Otherwise, I'd say 40, 30, whatever. I mean, we have 25-foot lots, 30-foot lots, and 40-foot lots are generally what our plats have in them right now. I mean, all those plats were done 100 years ago, so well before we had zoning. And at that point, they didn't care. That seemed like a good idea. That was the right amount of property. And if you wanted a big lot, you could have a big lot. And if you wanted a small lot, you could have a small lot. That still makes sense to me.
It's part of the character of our community as well, yeah.
I agree with that.
So no minimum lot?
No,
Well, should we throw 40 out there?
I think
I'm
we should-
comfortable with 40 being the
I
bottom.
want
I
37
mean,
and a half.
if it's 50.
Well, I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering about like, I mean, like, what's the standard? Like, if you have
38.
if you have a 75-foot piece of property and you like,
Oh, I see.
you want to divide it, then you
yeah.
have a piece that's worthless. You know, what I mean, like,
Yeah.
do you divide it down to 30 and you can say
How
like,
many of those do we actually?
I don't know.
You can't win that game, though.
Yeah.
You say it's 5 acre minimum, and then everybody with 4.8 or 9.6, it loses, right?
Yep.
And if you say it's 8, then everybody with the 4.2 or 8 point, it's just, you can't ever win that. You have to draw a line, and there's winners and losers, and it's unavoidable.
I don't know. This
You
is
can always buy
boring.
it.
so then why not
And-
make the line smaller?
Yeah?
I mean, I thought 40 was great, but now you're starting to convince me, like.
Then he
why
moved
not-
on you.
Why not 35
Yeah, but you
then?
don't want them all.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Because people, if you have 30-foot lots, I'll buy 2 and I'll have a 60-foot. I mean, people can make those decisions, you can let the market dictate it.
That's
Yeah.
right.
I mean, I guess what I liked about the 40 is it feels like a natural width that's already out there. So we already know we've got a lot of them.
Got it. Yep, I
That's
agree.
what I like.
would agree.
Yeah.
The
And
next
it's just like-
conversation that we need to have that makes more sense out of this
Yeah.
is the multiple unit construction rules.
Yeah.
When we start talking about 0 lot line setbacks, because the buildings are literally connected, but they're
Mhm.
separate ownership, because otherwise, I mean,
Yeah.
getting much smaller than 40 starts to be kind of silly.
Yep.
We're talking about somebody living in a tiny house eventually. If you're on a 30-foot lot, you have a 15-foot wide structure, that there will definitely be a market for. Somebody will want that. But, that's not really what we're going for. It's probably an easier way to allow that use.
We're gonna get to that, because for those, lot width is the key thing for those two. So, lot depth, just, the current is, the current's 120 when most of them are 135 to 140, so, I don't think it's a big factor unless we wanna, there are some that are 100, there's some that are 80, and, it does feel like if you're gonna impact lot depth to allow smaller lots, it's those, at least on your current blocks, it would be on the north and south ends. Where
Right.
something happens and you just wanna say, it really should not be lower than whatever yours is, I don't know what yours is.
My lot is 60 wide and 90 deep.
Yeah, so there's a
It's got
there's
a big
lower
house
number.
on it and a garage.
There's a lower number, like 100 or 90 or 75. Those are out there, so we can propose that,
If we don't have one at all,
or you don't have one at all.
we go back to lot area and say it
Well-
has to be 40 feet wide and at least 5,000 square feet, and then we don't care what it's shaped like.
In some cities, I have seen that word.
And that
it's
seems
just out
reasonable,
there.
because I think, for the most part, you're gonna have lots that are 135 feet 128 feet or whatever, and,
Yeah.
you know, if you get the 40-foot wide, you're gonna have the 5,000 square foot already, if you have one of those end of the block. And
You can't
most of
really
those,
win the end
most
of
of
the
those have
block.
been built, so
Yeah.
it's like, unless you're doing a redevelopment project on one of those,
Well, or you're making space in between, and so look at like 4th Street. Is it between 3rd Avenue and 4th Avenue where there's
Yeah.
5 tiny little cabins?
Right?
But that's a 40-foot depth
yeah.
for those 3 middle ones, right? So are we gonna say a lot depth minimum is 40 is okay? Because then we'll allow that to be replicated in a lot of different places.
Well, a lot depth is 40 feet, or is it the width that's 40 feet? Or,
Well, for those 3 middle ones, if they're facing the street, between the street and the top of that lot is probably 40 feet wide.
Yep.
yeah, but I guess that's, then depends on how you define
Which one's the front?
front yard, I mean, you
Yeah.
know.
You can make the same argument with your corner house. I mean,
Yeah.
when I look at your house, I think it's only 60 feet deep, you know, but depending on where you stand.
Yeah. You're stranded on the street or the avenue, right?
Yeah. My point is not, I mean, right now that lot is one lot, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That's got 5 houses on it, 5 tiny little
Right.
cabins on it.
Yes.
But if what we're looking for is more units, one of the barriers to more units is separate ownership. Developer almost always wants to be able to sell those units separately.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about what if those existed as 5 separate lots? Would we be willing to see that replicated?
I would.
In that location, probably people would say, because it's already.
It's already there.
It's already there, but
Yeah.
if somebody
But if we-
wanted to go over to,
Well, what if
there's
somebody
a lot
bought
on the corner of
cabins across the
8th
way?
Avenue West and 3rd Street, and the width, well, does it front 8th Avenue West, or does it front on 3rd Street? You know, I think it might be 80 feet wide, or 80 feet deep. I think it's 2 40-foot lots,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, that's the thing now. If we want, we've seen that in action in this town. We're comfortable with it. We're willing to have it replicated. But are we? Not everybody. So
Well,
that's
and we're not gonna make, like we pointed out, we're not gonna make everybody happy. There are
Yeah.
gonna be people who think like, oh, that sucks, let's not do that. Fair enough. But I think it's let's start, again, looking maybe not for a number, but at least looking towards our maximum, like what could we do?
And then maybe some things come off the table.
Yeah, but I would,
well. Let's leave this question because it really is only on those edges of the blocks where this exists.
Yeah.
yeah.
And maybe we get at that when we talk about multiple units, that those development rules, maybe that makes more sense then.
I don't think we need to talk about lot area, 'cause we've been talking about it with depth and.
I don't think there's a lot of, I'm not hearing people tell me we need to have a big minimum here. Yeah.
If you have other standards, you don't need a minimum
Right.
on this,
Yeah.
you know.
But if we didn't have any depth minimum at all, we've got a width of 40 feet.
It's gonna be around 4,000 or,
Well, if it's 100 feet deep, it's 4,000.
Yeah.
If it's 40 feet deep, it's not 4,000.
not.
It's 1,600. So do we care about that? Is that a problem?
Well, the only thing I can think about is, you know, going down on First Avenue West, you know, right up from where the chiropractor's office is. Some of those homes have been split off from the alley
Mm-hmm.
and split in half. I mean,
yeah.
would we want to see alley developments taking place where they split the property, you know, front to back to the alley and have 2 homes on that, on those small parcels? And those are, I think, 40-foot lots by, I don't know, 50 feet?
Well, and
60
it probably
feet.
doesn't matter what we think,
But do we want to see that, you know, I mean, is that something we want to, you know,
encourage?
potentially encourage? Yeah, that's the question, I think.
But again, I think sometimes we're driving back towards the market because we don't know. I mean, maybe that is part of it, maybe that's gonna be our thing, maybe that's what Grand Marais is known for, you know, I mean, who knows? But I'm not sure I wanna take it off the table, at least not right at this moment. I mean, I'd like to think about it as a possibility.
Yeah, I think some of those houses, I think I know what you're talking about, some of those seem real cute and, you know?
And there are people who would not, I mean, when you walk up to it and you know that this is what it is, you know, and you decide to rent it or you decide to buy it, I mean, you
Yeah.
know what you're getting. You know,
Yeah.
it's not-
So
I
their
think
access
about, I
costs-
think about my backyard, you know, I've got, you know, a lot between my house and my neighbor's, it's right out my back door. I mean, I could go in there and split that up into multiple parcels that could create additional home sites.
Mhm.
Access from the alley, is that what you're saying?
Well, you don't have it, and a lot of places don't. I think the one you're talking about, one of the reasons it exists is because the alley was already there. That made it reasonable.
Mhm.
You know, our existing rules say every lot has to have access to a public street.
Right.
So if we were gonna allow that type of development to be more normal, we'd have to either change that or,
So when we're
But
saying that has to have access to a public street, are we calling an alley a public street, or is that?
no, I would say that lot was not created according to the way our rules are written.
Okay, my
Okay,
mistake.
so
I
other-
thought
so
having
other-
access to the alley would be considered public. That's not a public.
No,
No, okay, gotcha.
The code could say that,
code could allow it. It doesn't right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
but that would open up possibilities for ADUs for sure. Especially because if you think, I mean, so if you assume ADUs are gonna have to have parking on the block, on the lot,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but they're on the alley,
Side of it.
But I don't worry about depth and area when we're talking about an ADU because it's not gonna be owned separately.
Right, it's gonna be within.
right, but you have to get, parking most likely would need to be in the rear. near
Yeah.
The unit
I mean,
maybe, so you have to
that-
drive next to
Well,
the
they have
house
to,
to get back
Well,
there.
they have to
we
figure
wouldn't.
it out.
They wouldn't have to. They got to figure it out. Yeah, and they
Whereas-
gotta be
or
able to
ride a
rent it to
bike.
somebody.
you don't
Yeah.
get a, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, that might be one of the questions for the communities. Do ADUs require on-site parking?
They, according to our existing parking rules, they would, because we say per unit. So if they're adding a unit, they add a requirement for more parking.
Gotcha.
But that is, I would say that is a common discussion around cities having ADUs is, can you get rid of the parking requirement? Because then that's more affordable, because you don't have to find that parking spot on that lot,
Mhm.
which can be tricky to fit.
Yeah.
But as you create higher density, if you don't require on-site parking, you create a much higher demand for on-street parking. So,
Right.
you know, you can't have it both ways.
No, that's a big problem.
And of course, I don't think it's a big problem. I think
You
that
walk to work, man.
and you know, we have off-street parking in our lot, so easy for me to say, but we also have a lot of people that don't on our block.
Yes.
There's
it's
a
true.
lot of on-street parking in our neighborhood.
Mhm.
And I don't think it's a problem. And I look at some really dense neighborhoods that exist in the world, and the way that parking happens on street there is such a different universe than anything that occurs in this town, that I know it's manageable. And what I question is why we invest in a 40-foot street when we don't want it to be used 100% of the time. Like, all that acreage of pavement that we built, that's creating runoff, that costs money to build and maintain, and yet we are uncomfortable with the idea of
People use
the parking lanes being used on all the time. And I know
Well,
there's difficulties in
You know,
the
it
winter, but
works over in my neighborhood, my street, you know, it's a narrow street, but nobody parks on the street.
yeah.
And so that's not an issue. But you
Yeah.
go over to First Avenue West, nobody parks on their property. They all park on the street.
Yeah.
It's a problem for them because there's not enough width in the wintertime to get a driving lane through there. And that's, you know,
Well, but that's an exaggeration. because, you know, we've come through
Yes,
a pretty
I
heavy
know.
snow winter.
We're getting used
And
to
there's
it.
not been any accidents.
Yeah.
There's not been any lack of
No.
ability to get through.
No.
Not even on Sunday morning. You know, people manage. And I
Yeah.
think that we can rely on people to manage. So I do wonder about that. But I also know when we ask the community, they're going to tell us that they're pretty sensitive to parking as an issue because they have pretty regularly told us that.
Yeah, although I would agree that I think that it's something to be looked at. You know, I think that, I mean, really, having lived many places, you know, on-street parking, I don't know, I mean, that doesn't throw me.
this over
It doesn't-
Well, if
and I
it's-
don't know that if we're looking for density.
Otherwise, we'll be here all
I don't
night.
know. I mean, there is gonna be costs, and I think we've talked about that there are just gonna be costs to doing it different, but we're already paying a cost, so maybe this is one of those costs we pay, and we say, okay, yeah, maybe we allow for that.
I mean, if the story is, if you didn't have to have as much parking on your lot,
You
it'd
have
be
more
smaller,
room.
and the housing's more affordable.
Yeah, you'd
I
have
mean,
an ADU maybe on
That's a simple
property.
story, but
Right.
if it's part of that,
What are you
Equation.
saying about, we have these wide streets and we can't use them to park?
Well,
Other
we
people aren't
can,
using it.
we're just uncomfortable about it. Like, we always want people to not have to do that. We always want to require off-street parking.
Oh,
Well, why did we build the on-street parking then? If we
I
don't want people to
gotcha.
use
Don't
it.
you think that's because we're a tourism-related community? I know people that come to town and can't find a parking spot. I mean, Fisherman's Picnic all the way up at my house at the top of the hill,
Sure.
there's
Yeah.
cars parked, so I
Yeah.
think
That's
that's
probably the
part-
only 4 days that
Right.
anyone ever parks up
Well,
there.
but if you go down a few blocks, it's quite often.
Yeah, it is.
So I think that's the issue. And when people say the problem with parking, I don't think it's with people who live there parking on the street. It's,
Yeah.
I can never find a parking spot because,
But we may say like, okay, you wanna have a place to live, well, here's part of the cost. You may
Yeah.
not, I mean, you know, this house.
People
that's
might
been
park in
there-
front of your house
Yeah,
Yeah.
it might happen.
that aren't you.
yeah. Yeah, and
What's that car parked in front of my house? What are they doing?
I don't know them.
well, I mean, theoretically, it always comes back to me is that our borders are fairly set, unless we
Yeah.
create ways to inspire people to, invest in infrastructure, but we are trapped inside this circle.
I'd rather not
Yeah.
say trapped.
Locked
We're
in,
cozy.
walled in, rocked in.
We're a cozy people.
Yeah.
How about that?
Well,
you're underutilizing it, how about that?
We're definitely not trapped. Like, there's a lot of room for expansion that you've already recognized some of the cool stuff we can do.
So how
saying
do we
the
take all
streets-
this conversation and put it into something that we can actually move on to the next
Yeah.
step of this process?
Well, I
So
wanna get to the,
You're getting to the last
are we,
one.
are we ending at 6? Is that our goal?
That's my goal.
I don't know, but yeah, that's our goal.
That's
Sure.
our goal. Okay, so lot coverage, it's on the list here. I think the big story there is that the smaller lots today don't look like they're exceeding that 30%, so I don't think it's a limiting thing yet. I also don't think that there's a problem with it going up to 40% or 50%. The only concern is that North Shore Management Plan that's in your code that I don't have enough understanding of. That also has a 30% impervious coverage. And I
Yeah.
don't know if that's negotiable
That's,
or,
well,
I don't know how that,
yeah, that's, we're the different conversation, a different day.
Yeah.
That, the only thing that this talks to me about in important terms is runoff. And that's why North Shore Management Plan is talking about it,
yeah.
Okay.
is the higher amount of impervious surface, the more runoff that's created. That is already a problem here. And so more density is potentially going to exacerbate that. And so this is something we might consider not changing.
But-
So
but
what
the-
is that saying is that 30% minimum of the lot has to be covered with?
No. It's a
No, it's
maximum.
actually a maximum, not a minimum.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
sorry, it's a maximum, yep.
So no more than 30% can have structures on it.
God.
Or impervious.
Okay, that's a big change.
And he's saying that,
But-
looking
but-
at all the small lots, there's only a handful that actually exceed that.
So far, it doesn't seem like it's
So
an
that seems
issue,
natural.
but, that's not taking into account Morse new small lights, new small lots may have more or bigger garages than current small lots or things like that. I mean, there might be challenges with new types of housing or garage needs or anything like that, but right now, 30% doesn't seem unreasonable.
Right, and we could create a variance store for that type of a thing.
Well,
We can also say that affordable housing supply is more important than stormwater runoff management. I mean, we have to pick and choose sometimes, so.
Yeah. So I was expecting it
But
might
you don't
be
want to
limited.
compromise the town. I mean, you'd have to be
Yeah.
able to,
But any development that's gonna happen moving forward is not gonna be fast. So, we have time. So even if we weren't too worried about the stormwater runoff, and we said, whatever, there's a lot of time.
But
And even if we left it at 30, we're not gonna create a lot of barriers for people. So it's
No.
probably not worth talking more
Yeah,
about that.
that's what I think. Building width, I don't think that needs to be a standard going forward, but
it was put in there because at one time, the city council did not want mobile homes put in the city.
right,
I don't
which,
think we should have it.
And that,
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
it's
legally,
an
the state should
antiquated,
have it done, right?
Yeah.
you know,
They should be allowing them.
cross it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then mostly we've been talking about houses on smaller lots. So all the rest of these, I think it's an easier conversation. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but at a minimum, I think when we start talking about a duplex or multiplex, small, which we're in the definitions, that's just 3 to 6, so not a huge building. And then this is going up to, I think we said 7 to 18 or, bigger. I think we need to think about setting lot widths, if we're gonna have lot widths that are bigger. So.
And this is the lot width, like pre-development, because we're potentially gonna allow these to be cut into small pieces to be owned separately.
Well, not these, row houses we are.
What we have to consider is there's different sites in the city that have different, look at the Gopher cabins, they're all botched together. And they were approved earlier and they're low-income housing. So I think we have to consider every neighborhood, we can't blanket. I worry about blanketing minimums in this. Can't we do it by conditional use permits?
But I think the difference with Gopher though is, aren't all of them owned by one person? I mean,
The
they're not
land
like,
is.
what's that?
The land.
yeah.
The land is.
I think he owns all the trailers there now, maybe, but the trailer park model is you own your own trailer
Got it,
potentially, and you're
got it.
leasing the.
But that's the only low-income housing that we've put in there.
Right.
And I was very involved in it and I had a hard time getting it done.
There's
Right.
no doubt that that is a pressing need in our community.
But I think what we're trying to do here, Hal, is we're trying to simplify the rules so that people know what they're
And
getting
I'm
into.
all for that.
Yeah.
But we gotta be careful about when you put a minimum in, and then some people might use that minimum in the wrong place. So you can handle a lot of this by conditional uses.
Well, I think we're trying to allow opportunities here and not fix, the standards in a way that's gonna penalize, the ability to create more housing.
That's what I'm bringing up.
So I think what we're doing is addressing your concerns, but it's, the developer or the individual that's creating a property or a development is the one that's gonna have to bear some of that responsibility for figuring out how to make it work.
Yeah.
Because we're not gonna decide that. All we're gonna do is provide some standards, some basic framework, so that if they have an idea, they can figure out if it's gonna fit within our framework.
Well, I'm all for that.
Yeah.
So, I don't wanna rush through this next section. I wanna take as much time as we've taken with these last ones, but I really think we're running out of steam here, or at least we're running into that 6 o'clock
Yeah.
timeframe, so there's a couple of options. We can continue this conversation for your next regularly scheduled meeting, which is a month from now. Other things will have developed further by then.
So we'll have courtyard housing, tiny houses, mobile homes, in 8
And then
years.
this,
Or we can continue this meeting for a time when you're all available between now and then, and take another hour with it.
I could meet again next week.
I don't know if I can.
Okay.
Yeah, my schedule is, kind of up in the air.
I'm good for 2 weeks and then,
Well, if you're interested in that, we'll contact you all tomorrow, get your schedules, and figure out if there is a time that's available.
okay.
I think that's a good idea.
Otherwise, our
Yeah.
next regular meeting is on April 1st.
Yeah.
Um,
And we'd like to be able to come back on April 1st and have some, like, the next iteration of this,
Right.
and have it, something to look at.
Yeah.
So this slide, so you're only proposing lot width and we don't think about any of that? other-
Well, it's the determining factor. So
Okay,
if we're not focused on lot depth,
okay.
we're saying in general, I agree with that. Lot area is just a calculation of what typical lot depth is. And then these widths. So the widths, duplexes, when we looked at other cities, they're typically not a lot wider than what a house width is. So, it can go up more than that if you think. I don't think there's a lot of duplexes here, right?
No, there's not, and most duplexes here that weren't just a single-family home that was converted into 2 units run into the row house complex, like they want to be 2 separately owned side
Yeah, yeah,
connected buildings.
yeah. Yeah, so the duplex means 2 units on the same lot.
And this whole slide means multiple units on the same lot with the same owner.
Yeah,
And if-
Oh, same, oh.
and
One
so-
owner.
And so if we were to reduce lots to 40 feet wide, then they would be required to buy 2 to do some of these things?
Well, we might say, we're not, if we say the minimum lot width is 40, that doesn't mean suddenly all the lots are 40, right? There's still, you can buy a piece that's 40 or 50 or 60 or whatever. And so if we're just saying our minimum lot width is gonna get bigger depending upon the use.
Yeah,
So
so-
that we'll classify a number of units in a particular arrangement and say the new minimum lot width for that use is this. This is a way that we take the R2 regulations and combine it into the R1, so there's only one zone, but we're saying that there is a larger minimum lot size for the multi-unit uses, or whatever, a larger, whatever else we want. And it's not quite as large as the existing R2 25-foot side and 40-foot front yard
Right,
setback
right, right.
requirements, but, yeah.
yeah, and so, someone might say, well, if it's a duplex, it's gonna be 50% bigger, or it's gonna be double of what the minimum is for a house, but, well, number one, the setbacks are gonna be the same, so it's not gonna just be double, because it's the same setbacks. And a lot of times duplexes, they can be different forms, but a lot of times they are narrower and deeper, so, it's deciding how much more room to allow for a duplex over a house. Or duplex could be up and down, so it really doesn't get any wider. And like Mike said, it's a minimum, but, if the goal is to allow flexibility to get down to smaller lots, this one wouldn't have to go up very much. This one, 3 units is not a lot bigger than 2 units, so it goes up a little bit also, without getting prescriptive about the exact form of that building. And then, as you go up in units, again, this is based on precedents in other cities that we've looked at, that goes up again to 75. Nice thing about that is you have 75-foot lots, so if somebody.
Yeah, we have a regular lot, so maybe
So
different
they
things can
can't
work.
split their lot to create new wealth in their life, but they could potentially redevelop their single-family home into a 6-plex apartment building. And, in any large developed city, you can see thousands of these.
Yeah.
They fit in, they don't look.
Yeah.
And we've got some,
Right.
Jeff's provided some ideas of what they might look like.
Yeah.
And then apartments go up to 100 foot. And then, over here is thinking about the side yard setbacks, because they are gonna be you know, next to other things that already exist if you're not expanding the city's residential area with this discussion that we're having. So duplex, the idea is that a duplex is not significantly bigger than a house. It's just 2 units instead of 1, so it's, the setbacks could be the same, is what I'm proposing. Multiplex, if there's an alley, maybe it's the same. If there isn't an alley, maybe it should be bigger because there's gonna be multiple units with cars. And you probably wanna have that space that you can park behind it. Again, if you have the alley, I mean, a lot of times I think if you think of this, I think of an alley with garages off the alley. But that's a discussion, you know, that would need to be figured out. These wouldn't necessarily be on alleys. We don't know that at this point, right?
Yeah, and I think this is probably where we need to stop because this gets complicated too. It's due the same amount
Complicated.
of thought. So,
Jeff, thanks for all your hard work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you know, we're just
Well,
wishing
I
to
don't
show
know.
us before we,
before we shut down?
Shut down,
I think we're not gonna do that. This is a question for Mike. Do we want to do something? We talked about the community at the last meeting and getting something out there to get their input on.
So we've been talking about this is going on, but we haven't really come up with a good question to ask. And other than like put the proposal out there and let people react to it, which is how we've talked about it tonight, I don't know that we've come up with a good strategy. The problem is, if we ask people about setbacks, it's kind of divorced from the idea of the goal is more units. If we ask people about more units, they've already told us, like, we don't need to ask that. We've asked that, and it's been told to us many, many times. So then what do we ask people?
Do we ask them what areas of Grand Marais you like the looks of for housing? Do you like the big lots out of east side of town? Do you
But
like
what if
the
they
inside-
don't, you know?
I don't know. Do you,
Yeah.
does that matter? Do we get an opinion of,
I think it's so subjective and difficult for us to use, that's the problem.
Yeah.
And, you know, where are these things appropriate? That's not something we've gotten into trying to regulate with this path, so we don't want to ask that. So what's left to ask? And the really difficult part was trying to translate this language into something that's meaningful to people. Like, instead of asking about setbacks, ask about privacy, light and air, drainage. Which of these issues are more important to you? But really the question is, if you have to weigh those against making housing available, what's more important to you? So I don't know of a good way to have that conversation.
So what if
But then some of that translates into what's important for the city. Because people personally may not be on board with the idea, but as a city, we know it's important. Like, I may not be real excited about having somebody plunk down next to me, and yet, at the same time, I know it's a good thing. You know, we want that.
So we've really been focusing on and making a real effort towards building in some engagement in all of our projects that we've done. And what I'm just maybe realizing is we've already done the engagement on this when we did our community visioning, when we've done other things, and maybe we don't really need to go out and have that type of conversation. So instead, maybe it's just a lot more of pushing out our conversation that's happening here, getting the details out in front of people and seeing what happens, rather than having some sort of fixed, write your comments on this card sort of thing.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
well, I think we need to kind of set the tone based on these guiding, you know, principles here that we're working off of, you know, to let them know that this is the reason why we came to this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And we're asking you, you know, based on this framework that we're working from, are we going in the right direction? I mean, how is this, you know, fit with, you know, the community's concept of addressing
I think-
this housing issue?
I hear what you're saying. I just feel like we have to drive this thing a lot further and get a little crisper information to give to people before I feel like we're ready to for them to give us something useful back.
That's the trick too,
Yeah.
is, you know, how do you get somebody up to speed on zoning to a point where there's useful feedback that comes back. And useful meaning like that we can use to do something
Well,
with.
maybe it's about who are you targeting? You know, for example, if I live in a certain place and people are building 4 blocks away, that might not be my business. I might not see it, I might not care as much. I'm gonna care who's next to me. But maybe it's about who has properties that they could sell. Who's got, you know what I mean, like, maybe that's the focus. Maybe the targeted audience isn't just everybody, because everybody has an opinion about everything. But maybe it's about like, do you have lot and, you know, how big is your lot? You were talking about, I could do this with my property. Well, what would you think about that? You know, maybe it's not about everybody, maybe it's about, maybe you have to go out and you have to find those people that you need to hear from. 'Cause
But I think you're
those-
right, though, is that it's easy to be, distance yourself from the conversation if it doesn't affect you directly. But, I mean, I think back to those lots on Eighth Avenue West. They came in and asked for a variance. There were people that opposed those variances because, you know, that didn't fit with the standards that, why should we allow these people to build on a lot that's less than the required minimum lot size? Well, it's,
The only townhouse in town exists on 8th Avenue, right down from your house. That was a Hanson woman put that together. It's a town, 2 units, wall to wall into one. And I was chairman of this planning, and we approved it. And nobody complained about it. Frank Hansen lived there for his senior life, and it was very reasonable in cost. And we don't have any townhouses in this Grand Marais, or in Cook County. And
Yeah.
when we're talking about all this, we've got to consider one thing: cost. We should try to find ways to lower costs of housing if we can.
Yeah.
That's the biggest problem here, without a doubt. If you're talking about zoning issues, you're never going to get a lot of people to agree on, you know, it's a difficult issue, and I don't blame people. Some people don't want this, and some people don't want that,
Yeah.
so Mike has to deal in the middle with all this, and he's done a great job.
Yeah.
We've got to kind of approach this with those guidelines, I think.
and I think we're trying to minimize costs by changing or addressing these
Yes.
barriers
Yeah.
that the
Trying to
ordinance-
maximize
that ordinance-
space.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
I
so.
totally agree with it.
Well, it is after 6 o'clock, so unless anybody else has.
I have one last comment.
Yes.
So you're gonna contact us and we're gonna look at our schedules and think about if we can get together in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
At the same time, could you also maybe give us, frame that same question, like what would we ask? If you could, like, you know, and then give us a chance to walk away tonight, let it settle for a little bit, maybe we could
Yep.
think about that.
The
That would be
commu-
helpful as
Community
well.
question?
Give us
Yes.
a little guidelines,
Yeah,
simply.
just at least ask the question again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can do.
All right,
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
well, we are adjourned.